Kansas City, Missouri, May 1950, the federal courthouse on Grand Boulevard. Joseph DiGiovanni, 62 years old, walks through the marble corridors toward the hearing room where the Senate Special Committee to investigate organized crime is waiting. Television cameras are positioned to capture every moment. Senators shuffle papers. Reporters lean forward in their seats. This is the Kefauver Committee, the first nationally televised investigation into the American Mafia. And Joseph DiGiovanni has been called to testify about 5 decades of alleged criminal activity in the heart of the Midwest. When he enters the room, the cameras catch everything. He's dressed conservatively, dark suit, white shirt, tie, an elderly man who could be anyone's grandfather. But his face tells a different story. Scar tissue covers his features, the skin pulled tight and shiny, the result of burns sustained decades earlier under circumstances that remain murky to this day. The scars are impossible to ignore, and they've defined his identity in Kansas City's underworld for 30 years. They call him Scarface. Everyone knows the name. No one knows for certain how he earned it. Senator Estes Kefauver looks at the man across the table and begins asking questions. Where was he born? When did he arrive in America? What has been his occupation? Joseph answers in a low voice, his English accented but clear. He's a liquor distributor. He's been in business many years. He's a law-abiding citizen who's been unfairly targeted by rumors. Then comes the question that will make headlines. Mr. DiGiovanni, have you ever heard of the Mafia? Joseph looks directly at the senators. I never even heard of the word Mafia, he says under oath. The statement hangs in the air. A Sicilian immigrant who has lived in America for nearly 50 years, who operates in Italian neighborhoods, who is sitting before this committee specifically because of suspected organized crime connections, claiming he's never even heard the word. Senators exchange glances, but Joseph doesn't flinch. Asked if he's ever been arrested, he responds firmly, No, sir. The senators have the records in front of them. They know this is false. But Joseph maintains the fiction, betting that they won't bother prosecuting an old man for perjury over statements that everyone in the room knows are lies. Here's what makes this moment extraordinary. Joseph DiGiovanni is sitting before the United States Senate, denying a past that is extensively documented, brazenly contradicting court records that prove multiple convictions, and doing it all with the kind of calculated confidence that allowed him to build and maintain a criminal empire for half a century. The scars on his face are a physical manifestation of his entire career, marked by violence, shrouded in mystery, and ultimately unpunished by any authority that tried to bring him down. But to understand how he got to this hearing room, how he became the man the Senate identified as one of Kansas City's top men in organized crime, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to cross an ocean, trace the path of a Sicilian immigrant family, and watch how America's greatest criminal opportunity transformed a teenager into one of the Midwest's most feared gangsters. The story begins not in Kansas City, but in the sun-scorched hills of western Sicily, where loyalty is currency and silence is survival. April 23, 1888, Sclafani, Sicily. Joseph DiGiovanni is born into a world where the concept of mafia is not yet a word widely used, but a way of life woven into Sicilian society. The village sits in the interior of western Sicily, a place where disputes are settled privately, where authority comes from respect earned through force, and where the local carabinieri are either bought off or irrelevant. Joseph grows up watching how power works in his homeland, how families protect their interests, how certain men command respect through means that have nothing to do with official law. The decision to leave comes in the early 1900s. Like hundreds of thousands of Sicilian families, the DiGiovannis are fleeing poverty, crop failures, and political instability. But there's another calculation for families who understand how Sicily's unwritten codes operate. In America, your past doesn't follow you. You can rebuild power from scratch in a place where no one understands the language you speak or the systems you know. Joseph, his brothers Pietro and Paolo, and their parents board a ship bound for America. In his later Senate testimony, Joseph would claim he arrived around 1903, though some accounts suggest it may have been as late as 1912. The exact date is uncertain, lost in the confusion of immigration records and conflicting accounts. But what matters is the destination: Kansas City, Missouri. They don't settle on the East Coast, where Italian organized crime is already establishing itself in cities like New York and Boston. Instead, they follow the railroad westward to Kansas City, a growing industrial hub at the confluence of the Kansas and Missouri rivers. It's a city hungry for labor, loose with law enforcement, and wide open for anyone willing to take what they can grab. The DiGiovannis settle in the north side, Kansas City's Italian Quarter, a neighborhood clustered around the stockyards and rail yards where immigrant labor is cheap and housing is crowded. Within years of arriving, the DiGiovanni brothers begin to notice something. The Italian community in Kansas City is prosperous enough to be exploited. Small business owners, shopkeepers, families who have saved money, they're all vulnerable. They're isolated by language, distrustful of American police, and conditioned by their Sicilian background to respond to certain kinds of pressure. Historical accounts suggest the DiGiovannis became linked to alleged extortion schemes in the Italian community, operating in the style of what some called black hand tactics: threatening letters, demands for protection money, and consequences for those who refuse to pay. How directly Joseph DiGiovanni participated in these early schemes is unclear from surviving records. No contemporary police documentation explicitly identifies him as a black hand organizer, but neighborhood whispers and later mob folklore placed the DiGiovanni family at the center of such activities. Whether these were organized operations or simply the reputation that came from being feared in a tight-knit immigrant community, the effect was the same. By the 1910s, the DiGiovanni name meant something on Kansas City's north side. Joseph's brother Paolo, Americanized to Paul, emerges as the family's leader during this period. Pietro, who everyone calls Sugar House Pete for reasons connected to his later business operations, handles enforcement and collections. Joseph's exact role in the family operation during these early years is less documented, but he's building the relationships and reputation that will serve him for decades. Then something happens that changes Joseph DiGiovanni's life forever, something that marks him literally and permanently and transforms him from just another Italian gangster into a figure that will dominate Kansas City's underworld for the next 40 years. The timing is somewhere around World War I, before 1920 certainly, based on photographic evidence and draft records. The exact circumstances remain one of Kansas City's most enduring mob mysteries. Official records simply note that Joseph suffered serious facial burns. Draft registration documents from World War I show he was medically disqualified from military service due to burn injuries. Photographs from the early 1920s show a man with bandaged hands and visible facial scarring. The skin changed by what must have been an intensely traumatic incident. But official records don't tell stories. The underworld does. And the story that circulated through Kansas City's Italian community passed from one generation of gangsters to the next, eventually crystallized into legend. According to this folklore, young Joseph attempted to firebomb a rival's building, either as part of an insurance fraud scheme or as an act of intimidation. The device, crude and unstable, detonated prematurely. Hot oil and fire cascaded across his face and hands. The resulting burns were catastrophic, leaving permanent scars that would define his appearance for the rest of his life. It's a dramatic story. It fits the narrative of a young gangster overreaching, paying a terrible price, and emerging more dangerous than before. But here's what we must be clear about. This is legend, not verified fact. No police report documents such an incident. No contemporary newspaper account describes a firebombing gone wrong. The story exists only in mob folklore, repeated in underworld circles and eventually picked up by crime historians as according to legend. What Joseph himself said about the scars adds another layer of uncertainty. In later statements to federal investigators, he reportedly claimed the burns came from a domestic lamp accident in his youth, a far more mundane explanation than the dramatic firebombing tale. Whether this was the truth or simply a cover story designed to avoid admitting to attempted arson is impossible to know. What we can say with certainty is this: Joseph DiGiovanni sustained severe burns before 1920. The scars were extensive and highly visible. They became his defining characteristic, his calling card, his brand. And whether the legend is true or fabricated, the effect was real. The scars transformed him into Scarface Joe, a name that would echo through Kansas City for decades. In the underworld, physical presence is currency. A man who looks like Joseph now doesn't need to make threats. His appearance is the threat. The scars tell a story. Whether that story is accurate becomes almost irrelevant when everyone believes it. They believe they're seeing a man who survived fire, who walked through violence and emerged marked, but unbroken, who wears his past as a warning about the future. And the timing of his transformation coincides with the greatest criminal opportunity in American history. January 17th, 1920. Washington, D.C. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution takes effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages nationwide. The Volstead Act, designed to enforce this amendment, creates a federal apparatus meant to eliminate America's drinking culture. What it actually creates is the largest black market in human history and the foundation for organized crime as we know it. In Kansas City, the reaction is immediate. The city's hundreds of saloons close their doors officially. Within weeks, they reopen as speakeasies, serving the same alcohol to the same customers, but now with the added profit margins that come from illegality and the requirement of paying protection to whoever can provide it. Kansas City is uniquely positioned for this moment. It sits at the crossroads of America, with rail lines running to Chicago, St. Louis, and the East Coast. It has a sprawling warehouse district perfect for hiding operations. Most importantly, it has the Pendergast machine. Tom Pendergast controls Kansas City through a corrupt Democratic political machine that operates with stunning efficiency. He controls the police, the courts, the mayor's office, and the city council. He decides which businesses get licenses, which criminals get arrested, and which laws get enforced. His arrangement with the underworld is straightforward. You can operate in Kansas City as long as you pay tribute, support his candidates, and don't create problems that force him to crack down. For the DiGiovanni brothers, this is the opportunity they've been building toward. They transition from alleged extortion to bootlegging with the smoothness of businessmen diversifying a portfolio. But they don't do it alone, and this is crucial to understanding Kansas City's Prohibition era. The DiGiovannis don't establish a monopoly. They form a cooperative syndicate. Joseph and Pietro DiGiovanni head what becomes known as Kansas City's Sugar House Bootlegging Consortium, partnering with several other Italian gangsters to control the supply chain that makes bootlegging possible. The name comes from their method. By dominating the supply of corn sugar, a critical ingredient for producing illegal alcohol, they can control who succeeds in the bootlegging business and who doesn't. If you want to make liquor in Kansas City, you buy your supplies from the DiGiovanni Syndicate. If you refuse, you don't make liquor. The operation is sophisticated. Paolo, until his death from natural causes in 1929, manages the political relationships with the Pendergast machine. Joseph, now operating under the Scarface nickname that has become his identity, handles logistics and enforcement. Sugar House Pete oversees distribution. They import whiskey from Canada and Mexico, but increasingly they manufacture their own product using legitimate businesses as fronts. Joseph uses a grocery store to order massive quantities of corn sugar and other distilling supplies, all perfectly legal purchases that get diverted to illegal operations. The syndicate sets up stills in warehouses across the North Side, employing teams of Italian workers who understand that silence is mandatory and loyalty is rewarded. By the mid-1920s, the operation is producing thousands of gallons per week. They position themselves as wholesalers rather than retailers. The DiGiovannis don't run speakeasies or gambling dens. They supply everyone else who does. This strategy is brilliant for multiple reasons. It insulates them from street-level violence and police attention. It gives them leverage over the entire criminal ecosystem. And it makes them indispensable to the Pendergast machine, which needs the speakeasies running to keep voters happy and money flowing. Senate investigators would later determine that Joseph and Pietro DiGiovanni had secured a dominant position in Kansas City liquor distribution, possibly including distribution rights for premium brands. This wasn't achieved through violence alone. It was achieved through business acumen, political connections, and the systematic control of supply chains that made competitors dependent on them. But the operation is not without friction. Other gangsters want into Kansas City's action. Johnny Lazia, a younger Italian with ambitions and connections, builds his own organization focused on gambling and prostitution. Charles Carollo, another Sicilian immigrant, starts competing in certain neighborhoods. Tony Marcella emerges as a player with his own bootlegging connections. Rather than starting a war, Joseph makes a calculated decision. Cooperation is more profitable than conflict. Late 1920s records show that Joseph and Pietro extended liquor credit to both Carollo and San Marcella, essentially bringing them into the syndicate structure as junior partners. This creates dependency rather than enmity. They owe money to the DiGiovannis, which means they have a financial interest in the family's continued success. The strategy works. Kansas City during Prohibition is remarkably violence-free compared to Chicago or New York. There are no major gang wars, no massacres, no headlines about bodies in the streets. The Pendergast machine keeps the peace from above, and the DiGiovanni syndicate maintains it from within the underworld. Everyone makes money. Everyone stays quiet. But there are costs. Joseph is arrested in 1920 and pleads guilty to an illicit liquor charge, paying a $500 fine. In 1928, he's caught running a still and pays another $500 fine. Then, in 1929, he pleads guilty to possessing an illegal whiskey still and receives 2 years probation. In 1930, he's sentenced to 60 days in jail and fined $400 for related offenses. These convictions are significant for 2 reasons. First, they prove Joseph DiGiovanni was directly involved in bootlegging operations, not just managing them from a distance. Second, they establish a criminal record that will follow him for the rest of his life, and which he will flatly deny under oath 20 years later at the Kefauver hearings. The jail time is minimal. The fines are pocket change compared to the profits rolling in. But the arrests show that even under Pendergast protection, the federal government can occasionally reach him. The key word is occasionally. For every arrest, there are hundreds of operations that proceed unmolested. The convictions are a cost of doing business, factored into the profit margins like any other expense. Paolo DiGiovanni's death in 1929 creates a transition point. Joseph, now 41 years old, assumes full control of the family operations. He's been the operational backbone for years, but now he's the boss in name as well as practice. The transition is smooth because Joseph has spent 2 decades building relationships, establishing his reputation, and proving his capability. No one challenges his authority. Sugarhouse Pete continues handling distribution, but everyone understands that Joseph is the ultimate decision maker. The timing is significant because enormous changes are coming. In 1933, the 21st Amendment repeals Prohibition. Overnight, the illegal alcohol business becomes legal again. For most bootleggers, this is a disaster. Their entire criminal enterprise vanishes. But Joseph DiGiovanni has been preparing. Even before repeal is official, Joseph and Pietro apply for liquor distribution licenses. They form the Midwest Distributing Company, located at 11th and Cherry Streets in downtown Kansas City, and position themselves to become legitimate wholesalers of the same products they've been selling illegally for 13 years. It's a masterpiece of business planning. Take your criminal infrastructure, your distribution network, your political connections, and your customer base, then simply legalize it. The license application is complicated by their criminal records. During the 1946 to 1947 state licensing review, Joseph and Pietro claim they cannot read English when questioned about prior convictions. It's absurd. They've been operating a sophisticated business in America for decades, but it provides plausible deniability. A local pastor vouches for their character, testifying that rumors of their criminal activities are unfounded. The licenses are approved. Midwest Distributing Company becomes remarkably profitable. By the late 1940s, the company generates between $55,000 and $80,000 per year in revenue. Joseph also collects between $4,000 and $9,000 annually in rent from warehouse properties. These figures represent extraordinary wealth, equivalent to well over $500,000 annually in modern terms. But the operation is more than just legal liquor sales. The legitimate distribution business provides access to bars, restaurants, and private clubs across Kansas City. That access allows the continuation of traditional rackets. Pressure on bar owners to buy exclusively from Midwest. Distributing business consulting that looks suspiciously like protection money. Mysterious problems for establishments that try to source their liquor elsewhere. The legal business launders illegal revenue, provides legitimate income for tax purposes, and insulates them from federal prosecution. The 1930s and 1940s see Kansas City's underworld evolve. Johnny Lazia takes control of Northside gambling operations with Pendergast's blessing, but is gunned down in 1934. Murdered by rivals or possibly his own associates, Charles Benaggio emerges as a political fixer between the mob and City Hall. Anthony Gizzo takes over gambling rackets. Nick Civella, representing a younger generation, begins building the organization that will eventually control Kansas City through the 1970s. Through all of this, Joseph DiGiovanni remains relevant. He's no longer the operational boss. That role passes to younger, more aggressive leaders. But he's the elder statesman. His approval carries weight. His opposition can be dangerous. When disputes arise between factions, Joseph often mediates. When new gangsters need introductions to political connections, Joseph makes them. He's transformed from a street-level enforcer into something more valuable, a symbol of continuity within the criminal hierarchy. His relationship with the Pendergast machine persists, even after Tom Pendergast himself is convicted of tax evasion in 1939 and sent to federal prison. The machine continues operating through surrogates. Joseph maintains connections with city officials, police commanders, and political operatives who value the Italian vote in North Side wards. He's no longer just a criminal buying protection. He's a political power broker with a criminal past. But the federal government is paying attention. New laws, emboldened prosecutors, and successful cases against major gangsters like Al Capone signal a shift in how organized crime will be fought. The FBI opens files on Kansas City mobsters. The Internal Revenue Service investigates the sudden wealth of men who report modest incomes but live comfortable lives. Treasury agents follow money trails, document cash flows, and build cases that can't be defeated by local political connections. Then comes the moment that will expose Joseph DiGiovanni to national scrutiny and crystallize his legacy: the Kefauver Committee hearings. Which brings us back to where we started. May 1950, the federal courthouse, the television cameras, the senators with their questions. Joseph DiGiovanni, 62 years old, his scarred face now part of American living rooms across the country, sitting under oath and denying a past that court records prove beyond doubt. "Have you ever been arrested?" the senators ask. "No, sir," Joseph responds. The answer is demonstrably false. The 1920 conviction, the 1928 conviction, the 1929 guilty plea and probation, the 1930 jail sentence. The records are right there, documented in Kansas City courts, easily verifiable. But Joseph maintains the lie with the same calculated confidence that built his empire. "Have you ever heard of the mafia?" "I never even heard of the word mafia." A Sicilian immigrant who operated in Italian organized crime circles for 50 years, claiming ignorance of the most famous term in that world. It's theater. Everyone knows it's theater. But Joseph plays his part perfectly, betting that the political spectacle of the hearing matters less than the fact that he won't provide the testimony that could actually be used against him or his associates. The committee's final report, released in 1951, is devastating despite his denials. The senators identified Joseph DiGiovanni, along with James Balistrere, as one of the two top men in Kansas City's organized crime structure. The report documents his role in building the city's bootlegging operations. It traces his connections to political corruption. It exposes Midwest distributing as more than just a legitimate business. The report recommends federal prosecution and increased law enforcement attention to Kansas City. But no prosecution comes. Joseph is too careful, too well insulated by layers of legal maneuvering and legitimate business fronts. His actual operations run through intermediates. His money flows through legal channels. His political connections are maintained indirectly. The federal government can expose him, but they can't build a case that will result in conviction. The Kefauver hearings do have consequences. Public attention forces Kansas City's mob to become more discreet. The era of wide-open operations is over. Nick Civella and other younger gangsters understand that visible leadership is now a liability. The organization becomes more sophisticated, more corporate, more hidden. Joseph's style, built on personal presence and that unforgettable scarred face, is obsolete in this new environment. He understands this. Rather than fight the inevitable transition, he begins retreating from active leadership. He keeps his ownership stake in Midwest distributing and continues collecting revenue. But day-to-day underworld operations pass to the next generation. Anthony Gizzo takes over gambling. Nick Savella builds the structure that will dominate Kansas City organized crime for decades. Joseph becomes what he was perhaps always destined to become, a legend whose name still carries weight, but whose active involvement is no longer necessary. The 1950s and 1960s see Joseph DiGiovanni fade from public view. He lives quietly on Gladstone Boulevard, a respectable middle-class neighborhood far from the North Side streets where he built his reputation. Details of his personal life remain scarce. No public records confirm whether he had children, and his domestic situation was kept intensely private. He attends church, maintains occasional contact with younger mobsters, and makes infrequent appearances at Midwest Distributing's offices. Police surveillance continues sporadically. Detectives note his meetings with known criminals, his attendance at funerals of old associates, his continued presence in the Italian community. But there's no evidence of active criminal conduct. He's a retired gangster, living off the profits of a career that spanned 5 decades and somehow resulted in only minor convictions and brief jail time. The question haunts investigators. How did he get away with it? Joseph DiGiovanni operated in Kansas City for 50 years, built a bootlegging empire, maintained connections to every major criminal figure in the city, testified before the Senate, and yet died free, wealthy, and never convicted of anything serious. The answer is complex. First, he was smart. He kept operations insulated from his personal involvement. He avoided the flashy violence that attracted headlines. He understood that steady profits matter more than dramatic displays of power. Second, he understood political reality. By cultivating the Pendergast machine and its successors, he ensured that local law enforcement would never seriously threaten him. Federal agents might investigate, but they needed local cooperation to build cases. Third, he evolved with circumstances. When Prohibition ended, he didn't cling to illegal operations. He transitioned to legal distribution. When the Kefauver hearings brought scrutiny, he retreated from visible leadership. He knew when to push forward and when to step back. Fourth, he maintained silence. He understood omerta in the truest sense. He never talked. His associates never talked. His family never talked. Without testimony, without informants, without witnesses willing to appear in court, there were no prosecutable cases. August 5th, 1971. Kansas City, Missouri. Joseph DiGiovanni dies of natural causes at the age of 83. The obituary is brief, noting he was a retired businessman and longtime Kansas City resident. There's no mention of organized crime, the Kefauver hearings, or the bootlegging empire. His funeral is modest, attended by family and a handful of old associates who remember when Scarface Joe ruled the North Side. The cemetery service is quiet. A small crowd gathers, relatives, perhaps a few younger mobsters paying respects to history. There are no reporters, no police surveillance, no federal agents. Joseph DiGiovanni exits the world the way he spent his final 2 decades, quietly, privately, leaving more questions than answers. But his legacy is undeniable. Every history of Kansas City organized crime begins with the DiGiovanni brothers. Nick Savella, who controlled Kansas City's mob through the 1970s, reportedly credited Joseph with laying the foundations of organized crime in the city. That foundation included the political connections that enabled corruption, the business model that balanced illegal activity with legitimate fronts, and the code of silence that kept members protected. The Kansas City family that Joseph helped create lasted decades after his death, surviving federal crackdowns and internal struggles until RICO prosecutions finally dismantled much of the organization in the 1980s. Even then, the family's influence in Kansas City politics and business persisted for years. Modern Kansas City barely remembers Joseph DiGiovanni. The neighborhoods where he operated have changed. The buildings that housed his operations are gone. The political machine that protected him collapsed long ago. Midwest, distributing closed years after his death. But the scars remain, at least in memory and legend. The question that titled our story, "How did this mobster get his scars?" remains partially answered and partially mysterious. We know he was burned, severely enough to be disqualified from military service. We know the scars defined his criminal identity for 50 years. We know they became his calling card, his brand, the physical manifestation of a reputation built on fear. What we don't know for certain is whether the legendary story is true. Did the young Joseph DiGiovanni really crouch in an alley preparing an incendiary device that exploded in his face? Or did some other violent incident, an attack by rivals, an industrial accident, even the lamp explosion he later claimed, cause the burns? The mob folklore is dramatic and fits the narrative perfectly. But mob folklore often does. Here's what matters. Joseph DiGiovanni transformed teenage burns, whatever their cause, into the foundation of criminal power. He understood that in the underworld, appearance matters as much as action. A scarred face tells a story. People believe that story. And belief creates reality. For 50 years, when Joseph DiGiovanni walked into a room, conversation stopped. Not because he announced himself or raised his voice, but because everyone who looked at him saw those scars and remembered the legend attached to them. They saw a man who had survived fire, who wore violence on his face, who couldn't be intimidated or stopped. Whether the legend was true became irrelevant. The power it generated was real. He came to America with nothing. He built an empire during Prohibition. He survived the transition to legal business. He outlasted most of his Prohibition-era peers and remained influential into the mid-20th century. He testified before the United States Senate and lied under oath without consequence. He died peacefully, wealthy, surrounded by family, having never spent significant time in prison. The scars were real. The empire was real. The legend that connected them, the story of a botched arson, a premature explosion, fire cascading across a young gangster's face, that story remains what it always was. Unverified folklore that became more powerful than any documented fact. Joseph Scarface DiGiovanni took his truth to the grave. What he left behind was a name, a reputation, and scars that stopped conversations for half a century. In the end, that was enough to build a legacy written in bootleg whiskey and political corruption on the streets of Kansas City. A legacy that still echoes today whenever crime historians discuss how one Sicilian immigrant helped transform American organized crime from street-level extortion into the sophisticated criminal enterprise we recognize today. The scars told a story. Joseph DiGiovanni made sure that story, whatever its truth, served his purposes perfectly.